All right, and welcome to the third of our video lectures for American Studies 328E, U.S. Latino Studies 498E. So, this time we're filming from the exciting locale of my bedroom, a rare look inside the life of an academic. Anyway, last time we focused on the two articles about popular culture from week 1. Stuart Hall's article on deconstructing the popular, as well as the introduction to Hop on Pop, which tries to define what popular culture is. This time we'll be focusing on the two articles about race, racial formation in the United States, and I gave you the introduction from Eileen O'Brien's The Pan-Ethnic Middle, which talks very specifically about Asian Pacific American and US Latina populations. So we have a series of key terms to go over in this video lecture, so bear with me, this will be a little thick. So first we're going to begin with Michael Omi and Howard Wynod's Racial Formation in the United States. I gave you Chapter 4, and if you're interested, a couple of pages from the conclusion. You're responsible for Chapter 4 because this is where they define racial formation, one of the key terms that we'll be using throughout this course. So here we have 4 different words, all related to this subject of talking about racial identity and racial difference in US culture, but what I want to do here is unpack these differences in meaning. So first, beginning with race. So we can understand race as this cultural logic of classifying bodies. We call it cultural because even though we can think of our bodies as biological, the way that we understand these bodies as being different is distinctly cultural. And in fact, if you go outside of the US context, you can see how culturally specific different racial categories are. So, of course, there are white, black, Asian, Latino, and indigenous populations all the world over in every country in different proportions. But what's important to understand is that the way that we classify, the specific phenotypes and the specific characteristics that we use to give meaning to race, those are culturally specific. If you look at page 55 of the Omi and Wynot chapter, you also notice that their definition of race also includes how bodily differences become culturally related to the social conflicts and interests that get put into the meaning of race. So what they mean by this is, for example, later in the chapter they talk about a brief glimpse of US racial history as we talk about the transition from US racial dictatorship to racial hegemony, which kind of characterizes the moment that we live in now. So we need to look at the difference between race and racism. So when we're talking about race, when we talk about it as a cultural logic of classifying bodies, that also refers to the historic social conflicts and interests. For example, look at the beginning pages of the Eileen O'Brien introduction, where she talks about, for example, immigration history, where immigration law specifically named Asians and Latinos and African Americans by their race. So that's what we mean. Because these categories have such a history to them, that's why we also must attend to the specific histories of social conflict and interests that go along with them. So, besides just the bodies, we're also talking about these specific cultural meanings. So, the way that we'll be talking about race in this class is through this theory of racial formation. So, if you turn with me to page 55. There they define racial formation as, quote, the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. Racial formation is a process of historically situated projects in which human bodies and social structures are represented and organized. Racial formation is linked to the evolution of hegemony. So we can think of racial formation processes as occurring through a linkage between structure and representation. Okay, so there's a lot there. So if we're talking about racial formation, we're talking about this specific cultural process through which we create meaningful racial categories. And when I talk about meaningful, I'm talking about filling them with specific meaning. Racial formation can be understood as the process through which race comes to have meaning. And when we talk about the relationship in racial formation between structure and representation, on the one hand, we're understanding how race takes on material dimensions, right? Material referring to what you have, what you own, the sorts of wealth and opportunities that are available to you. We can understand it as both material and ideological. Recall the definition of ideology from the video lecture on popular culture. And, as Omin will not talk about later in the chapter, we can understand race as having to do with a specific relation between, for example, policy and culture. So it's not just about stereotypes, it is, for example, about the history that gives those stereotypes meaning through the sorts of material disadvantages that became attached to them. If, for example, we're looking at the stereotype of Asian American men and penis size, that is a stereotype that again and again has been disproven. Penises are the same. Please excuse my example, but if we're talking about the meaning given to bodies, there is this ongoing anxiety about sexuality and penises. So, we can understand the specific history of that stereotype once we start thinking about it in the long term. This stereotype goes all the way back to the first waves of Chinese immigration, when the Chinese came to America as part of a labor workforce, and there had to be boundaries drawn in order to prevent intermarriage and sex across the race line. So in order to do so, masculinity became a way of differentiating between the races. So, and I'll talk about this also later in the lecture, if we're talking about racial difference, we're not talking just about race. In the example that I gave, racial difference operates through gender. So throughout this course, we'll be focusing on intersectionality, which I don't have up here, but we'll be returning to it a lot throughout the class. If we're talking about taking an intersectional approach, we're thinking about all these different dimensions of identity and difference all at once. For example, if we look at race and gender, it's different to be, for example, a Latino man as opposed to a Latina woman. Even though race stays the same, gender changes. But at the same time, it's different to be a Latina as opposed to being a white woman, because there we're looking at differences in race. So we're thinking about all these different combinations of identity and difference, and we're not reducing them down. So, we talked about race, we talked about racial formation. Also related to racial formation is their definition of racial projects. In the definition of racial formation from the text on page 55 to 56, they talk about specific projects. We can think about the way they define racial projects are as an interpretation, representation, and explanation of racial dynamics. So we can understand racial projects as feeding into specific racial formations, right? Racial formation as this large process through which we place meaning on race. To take another example, there is no correlation, for example, between being Asian Pacific American and being good at math. It has nothing to do with our bodies themselves, but the cultural meaning that gets placed on them. This all takes place through this larger process of racial formation. But we can also think about individual racial projects. For example, every time there's a specific attempt to try and explain why Asian Pacific Americans are so good at math and computers, there's a specific socioeconomic explanation that in no way can be reduced down to race, but oftentimes is. So racial projects, racial formation, and race. So, then on page 71, we get to a specific definition of racism. We can understand things as being racist when they produce structures of domination. Right? Omi and Wanat are careful to talk about the difference between racial awareness and racism. Racism is always related to power. So, for example, recall our diagram of hegemony from the previous lecture. As Omi and Wanat talk about throughout the chapter, the way that racism works today is very related to hegemony, as opposed to the strict lines of the racial dictatorship in, for example, the Jim Crow South. Now we're thinking about this relationship of ideology and the ways in which consent is given to particular racial formations. Also not included in the chapter is this definition of racialization, right? So race, racial formation, racism, and racialization. Racialization refers to the active process of assigning racial meanings. So, for example, if something is racialized, it is referring to a racial category and assigning it that type of meaning. All right. So, the point of thinking through race and racism is to really think about the ways in which we can actively be anti-racist in our exploration of Asian Pacific American and US Latino popular culture. Because the point is not to be post-race, but to be post-racist, right? To eliminate forms of racism while still just being bodily different. The issue is not that we are different, and the issue is not recognizing that people are different, because after all, as Omi went on to talk about, racial formation is a dialogue between this large macro-scale hegemony, this large national issue, and our everyday experiences. So the problem is not race, but racism. And we can think about, for example, positive racial formations or rectifying negative racial formations as significant anti-racist work. All right, so that covers Omi and Wenant. So next you have the chapter from the Pan-Ethnic Racial Middle that talks very specifically about Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinos. So, by recognizing race as a cultural process, we can understand how race is socially constructed, right? In this large view of society and culture, race is a very specific construction that we produce and reproduce through everyday interactions and through the particular kind of social order that we recreate. So, even though there is a very important aspect to anti-racism on the individual level, for example, not saying racist things to one another, that alone doesn't make racism disappear. As Omi and Wenant made clear, there is a material dimension, for example, the differential access to education, on the one hand, or the glass ceiling that exists for all different kinds of racial, sexual, and gendered minorities. We can think of those as the material dimensions that give weight to why it's important to be anti-racism. Also, residential segregation, another large issue that still needs to be addressed. All right. So, what I'll give you is just kind of a brief walkthrough of some of the highlights of the chapter. On page 2, you'll notice that part of the reason why it's significant to focus on Asian Pacific American and US Latino communities is because, as we can see in the 2000 census, and soon we'll see in the 2010 census, is that both of them constitute significantly growing racial populations. So, part of what we'll want to do in this class is look at the differences in the ways in which these groups are racialized. If we look at pages 3 through 6, you get a very brief history of these differences in racialization. They talk about, for example, the colonization of the West and how that became part of the United States, even though it was formerly part of Mexico, as a significant part of Latino racial history. We also get a brief view into the Chinese Exclusion Act and how that's a very significant moment in Asian Pacific American history. You'll notice that these examples are deeply historical, dating back centuries ago, because an important thing to understand is that even though Asian Pacific Americans and Latinas and Latinos are sometimes part of immigrant communities, these populations are not new to the United States, not just immigration-wise, but also culturally, because we've been aware for centuries now that there is this different kind of racial difference. So then pages 6 through 12 are kind of the important part of thinking about how Asian Pacific American experiences and US Latina and Latino experiences are different not just from white American experiences, but also from African American experiences. On page 8, there's the historical explanation of